A pregnant Norse widow discovers a Saxon warrior chained to her fence post. What she did in silence defied her entire clan, and proved that compassion knows no borders, even in the brutal Viking age. The widow's mourning. The first ray of dawn pierced through the smoke hole of the longhouse, awakening Astrid Thorvald's daughter with that familiar emptiness that had haunted her every morning for the past 5 months. Her hand instinctively reached for the cold side of the sleeping bench, where her husband Halvard once lay, but found only the fur blankets that held no trace of his warmth. At 8 months pregnant, every movement was a battle against the weight she carried, not just in her belly, but in her soul. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing its mother's sorrow. She rose slowly, both hands supporting her aching back. The settlement of Ravensfjord awakened with its familiar sounds. Roosters crowing, cattle lowing in their pens, horses neighing impatiently. But without Halvard, these sounds had become hollow echoes of a life that once felt complete. Everything reminded her that she was utterly alone in this harsh corner of Northumbria, where dangers lurked from every direction. Saxon raiders, rival clans, and the unforgiving winter that approached. Astrid dressed in her most comfortable wool dress, the blue one Halvard had traded for on his last journey to York, back when they didn't yet know she carried his child. She tied her apron over her swollen belly and walked to the hearth, where silence pressed heavier than anywhere else in the longhouse. Here she had prepared thousands of meals for her husband. Here they had planned their family's future. Here they had dreamed of the children they would raise and the legacy they would build together in this harsh but beautiful land. While preparing her morning ale with slightly trembling hands, memories of that terrible night flooded back, as they always did, in moments of deepest silence. The night of loss. Halvard had gone to check the livestock after hearing strange noises near the river. "Just a wolf, my love," he had said, kissing her forehead with that reassuring smile she cherished. "I'll return within the hour." But that was the last time she saw him alive. The warriors from Jarl Eric's warband found him at dawn. A Saxon spear through his chest, and an expression of surprise that spoke of death arriving without warning. Since then, Astrid had lived in constant mixture of grief and fear. Grief for the man she loved, and fear for the baby growing in her womb who would be born never knowing his father. The village elders had suggested she sell the farmstead and move to a safer settlement. But this piece of land was all she had left of Halvard. Every tree, every stone, every corner held memories of their life together. She could not simply abandon everything. The ale tasted bitter that morning, as if even flavors had changed after her husband's death. She wrapped herself in the cloak her mother had woven years ago and stepped outside, where golden dawn light painted everything in warm tones. The walk to the boundary. Her steps led her automatically toward the eastern boundary of their land, where Halvard always said the grazing was best because the grass grew thicker near the stream. It was a long walk for a woman in her condition, but she needed to check for breaks in the fence. Cattle theft had increased since her husband's death, as if thieves knew the farm was now protected only by a pregnant widow. The path wound between birch trees and rocky outcrops, and each step reminded her of times she had walked here beside Halvard, listening to his plans to expand the farm, his dreams of raising strong sons and daughters, his vision for improving their livestock. He had possessed clear vision of the future, unshakable confidence that they could turn this harsh land into something prosperous. Now she must carry that vision alone, protect it and nurture it, as she protected and nurtured the baby in her womb. When she reached the farthest corner of the property, Where an old oak post marked the boundary between her land and the wild territory stretching toward the Saxon kingdoms, what she saw froze her in shock and horror. The chained captive, there, bound to the post with thick iron chains that cut into his wrists and ankles, was a man. But not just any man. By his distinctive Saxon clothing, his shorter cropped hair, and the Christian cross hanging around his neck, he was clearly a Saxon warrior, one of the very people responsible for her husband's death. The man was semi-conscious, his head hanging forward, his body lacerated where the chains had been tightening for hours, perhaps all night. His breathing was labored, and Astrid could see his lips were cracked from thirst. His skin reddened by the merciless sun. Someone had placed him there deliberately, chained like an animal, abandoned to die slowly in the elements. It was a cruel death, designed not just to end a life, but to humiliate and torture before the final moment. The Saxon's eyes opened slowly as he sensed her presence, meeting Astrid's in a gaze that pierced through her like lightning. It was not the look of a savage, as she had heard Saxons described in the mead hall stories. It was the look of a human being who suffered, who had been humiliated and abandoned, but who still retained a fierce dignity that moved her to her core. In those dark eyes, she saw pain, yes, but also an inner strength that refused to break even before death. The moment of choice. For a moment that felt eternal, Astrid stood motionless, her heart pounding so hard it seemed to want to escape her chest. All the tales she had heard about Saxon treachery, all the warnings about their brutality, all the fears she had accumulated since Halvard's death, they crowded her mind like a storm. But she also remembered something her grandmother had taught her as a child. When you see suffering, do not ask where it comes from. Pain has no tribe or religion, only need for mercy. The Saxon tried to speak, but only a hoarse sound emerged from his parched throat. His lips moved, forming words in his language that Astrid could not understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was not a threat. It was a silent plea, a petition for mercy that transcended any barrier of language or culture. The baby in her womb kicked violently, as if reacting to her emotional tension, and Astrid instinctively placed both hands on her abdomen. It was then that something changed in the Saxon's expression. His eyes fixed on Astrid's swollen belly, on the way she supported her back, on the obvious signs of her advanced pregnancy. His face softened immediately, and in his gaze appeared something that surprised her. Respect, concern, almost reverence. It was as if the presence of new life she carried within her had awakened in him something sacred, something that went beyond the divisions between enemy peoples. The decision. Astrid looked around to ensure she was alone. Then she approached slowly to the post where the Saxon was chained. Each step was a conscious decision to choose compassion over fear, humanity over prejudice. She did not know what consequences this decision would bring. She did not know if she was endangering her own life or her baby's, but she knew she could not simply turn away and pretend she had seen nothing. Her heart, the same heart that had loved Halvard, the same that now beat with her unborn child's life, would not allow her to abandon a suffering human being. "I will not harm you," she whispered in Norse, though she knew he probably did not understand. But she hoped her tone, her gestures, her careful proximity would convey her peaceful intentions. The Saxon watched her intently as she examined the chains that held him prisoner. And for the first time since she had found him, Astrid saw something like hope flicker weakly in his weary eyes. The return for supplies. Astrid ran back toward her longhouse, with urgency she had not felt since the night she lost Halvard. Her heart raced, not just from physical exertion in her pregnant state, but from the tremendous decision she had just made. Once she helped him, there would be no turning back. She would become accomplice to a man her own people considered the enemy. Her hands trembled as she gathered what she would need: a large clay jug to carry water from the well, several clean cloths she had been saving for her baby's birth, the sharp iron blade Halvard used for cutting ropes, and the small flask of healing salve she kept for emergencies. Each object she took was a conscious decision to help someone who, according to everything she had been taught, should be her natural enemy. The water and healing. When she returned to where the Saxon was chained, she found him in an even more concerning state. The higher sun now beat down mercilessly, and the man had managed to shift position slightly, only worsening his situation as the chains had tightened even more around his wrists and ankles. She approached slowly, keeping her hands visible to show she brought water and help, not weapons. The Saxon watched her with mixture of distrust and desperate hope. His eyes, though tired and clouded by pain, followed her every movement with the caution of someone who had learned through experience that human kindness could quickly turn to betrayal. "Water," Astrid said in Norse, lifting the jug so he could see it clearly. Then she pointed to his cracked lips and repeated, "Water for you." Though she knew he probably did not understand her words, she hoped the universal gesture of drinking would be clear enough. The Saxon observed her for a long moment, as if making a crucial decision, then nodded almost imperceptibly. Astrid moistened one of the clean cloths in the fresh water and approached slowly until she was close enough to touch his lips. The Saxon tensed as she drew near, but did not pull away. With extremely delicate movements, Astrid pressed the wet cloth against his parched lips, allowing drops of cool water to run slowly into his mouth. The man closed his eyes and drank eagerly every drop he could obtain, as if it were the most precious liquid on earth. "More," the Saxon murmured in broken Norse, surprising Astrid. It was the first word she had heard him speak, and his voice was deep and rough from dehydration. But there was something in his tone that spoke of intelligence and dignity. The contraction. Astrid repeated the process several times, giving him water drop by drop, until she saw his breathing calm somewhat, and color return to his face. It was then that a sudden, painful contraction tore through Astrid's abdomen, making her release an involuntary moan and clutch both hands to her belly. It was not the first time she had felt these contractions during recent weeks, but the stress and physical exertion of the situation seemed to be dangerously intensifying them. The contraction lasted almost a full minute, during which Astrid had to concentrate on breathing deeply to avoid panic. The Saxon immediately noticed her distress. His expression changed completely, shifting from defensive caution to genuine, deep concern. His eyes fixed on Astrid's swollen belly, on the way she supported her back, on the obvious signs that the baby could arrive at any moment. When the contraction finally passed and Astrid could straighten somewhat, she found the Saxon looking at her with something that could only be described as reverential respect. "Baby soon," he said in his limited Norse, gesturing with his head toward Astrid's belly. You should not be here. Dangerous for you." His words were filled with sincere concern that moved her deeply. Here was a man who had been abandoned to die, chained like an animal, and his first worry when seeing she needed help was for her well-being and her unborn babies. The cutting of chains. "I am well," Astrid lied, though both knew it was not true. "But you need help now." She drew Halvard's sharp blade and saw how the Saxon's eyes immediately focused on the gleaming iron. For a moment, tension between them intensified. He did not know if she came to free him or finish what others had begun. Astrid realized his fear and slowly placed the blade on the ground between them. Then she stepped back a few paces. "To cut chains," she said clearly, making cutting gestures while pointing to the bonds tormenting him. "To free you." The Saxon studied her face for what seemed an eternity, searching for signs of deceit or cruelty. What he saw must have reassured him, because he finally nodded and extended his chained hands slightly forward, offering her access to the bonds. "How are you called?" Astrid asked while working on a particularly difficult chain link. The Saxon looked into her eyes before responding. "Aelred," he said with dignity that contrasted dramatically with his vulnerable situation. "Aelred of Wessex. And you?" "Astrid," she responded simply. "Astrid, Thorvald's daughter." The name of trust. As she worked on the chains, they began communicating through something deeper than words. When Astrid needed him to move his hand a certain way, a simple gesture was sufficient. When she tired and needed to rest, he remained completely still so as not to interrupt her work. It was like a silent dance between two human beings who had found a connection that transcended all cultural and racial barriers. "Why?" Aelred asked suddenly, his Norse broken but earnest. "Your people and my people. Enemies. Why you help?" Astrid paused in her work, meeting his eyes. "Because you are human," she said simply, "and humans should not suffer like this, no matter where they come from." But even as she spoke these noble words, another strong contraction tore through her abdomen, reminding her that her own situation was becoming increasingly precarious. The approaching danger. It was while working on the second chain that they heard the sound both had been dreading, hoofbeats approaching from the direction of the settlement. They were multiple riders moving quickly, and by the sound of their voices, Astrid could distinguish they were warriors from Jarl Eric's warband, the very men who had likely chained Aelred here. Aelred closed his eyes and murmured something in his native Saxon tongue that sounded like a farewell prayer. Clearly he expected those coming to be the same ones who had placed him here. Returning to verify their cruel punishment had taken effect. But Astrid would not allow that to happen. With speed that surprised even herself, she spread her cloak over Aelred's body, covering him completely. "Stay still," she whispered urgently. "Whatever happens, do not move." Then she sat on the ground beside the post, adopting the position of a pregnant woman who had come out to rest in the shade. Her heart pounded so hard she feared the warriors could hear it, but she kept her face serene and her breathing controlled when the riders appeared through the birch trees. The confrontation with Jarl Eric. There were 5 men, all armed, all with the hard expressions of those accustomed to doing brutal work. At the front rode Jarl Eric himself, a large man with cruel face who had been the terror of the region since arriving with his ruthless methods. His small, cold eyes immediately scanned the area around the post, searching for what he expected to find. "Good morning, Astrid Thorvald's daughter," Eric said with false courtesy that fooled no one. "I hope we have not frightened you. We only come to check something we left here yesterday." His gaze fell directly on the place where Aelred should have been chained, and Astrid saw how his expression hardened upon finding only cut chains scattered on the ground. Astrid maintained her serene face while responding with voice she hoped sounded natural and calm. "Good morning, Jarl Eric. You have not frightened me at all. I only came out for fresh air because the baby has me very restless this morning." She placed her hands on her swollen belly, perfectly playing the role of pregnant widow who had no idea what was happening. But inside, Her heart beat so hard, she feared the sound might betray her. Eric dismounted from his horse with slow, deliberate movements, like a predator who knows his prey has no escape. His boots thudded heavily against the dry ground as he approached the post where the cut chains lay like silent evidence of what had occurred during the night. He crouched to examine them, running his fingers over the clean cuts clearly made with a sharp blade. "How strange, Astrid Thorvald's daughter," Eric said with dangerously soft voice. "Yesterday afternoon, we left a Saxon prisoner chained here. It was well-deserved punishment for raiding our lands and killing good Norse folk." His cold eyes fixed directly on Astrid as he continued. "And now I find the chains cut, and no trace of the prisoner. Do you not find that a very curious coincidence?" The clever lie. Astrid's blood froze, hearing direct confirmation that Eric had been the one who abandoned Elred to die slowly. The cruelty in his voice, the way he spoke of torturing a human being as if it were completely normal, turned her stomach. But she knew she must maintain the act if she wanted to protect both Elred and herself. "A Saxon prisoner?" she asked with what she hoped was convincing surprise. "By the gods, Jarl Eric! And you left him here so close to my home, with me vulnerable in my condition?" Her indignation was genuine, though for completely different reasons than Eric might imagine. One of the younger warriors who had been examining tracks around the post approached Eric with concerned expression. "Jarl, there are women's footprints all over this area, small shoes, like a lady would wear. And there are wet spots where someone spilled water." His eyes turned toward Astrid's feet, clearly comparing the marks in the ground with her footwear. Eric straightened slowly, and Astrid could see his suspicions intensifying. "Astrid Thorvald's daughter," he said with courtesy that sounded increasingly threatening, "could you explain what you were doing in this area? Your longhouse is over a kilometer from here, and walking that distance in your condition must be very difficult." The wolf's tale. Astrid felt panic beginning to climb up her throat, but managed to maintain composure. "I come here every morning to check this part of the fence, Jarl Eric. Halvard always told me it was important to verify there were no breaks where livestock could escape." Her voice broke slightly, mentioning her dead husband, and the tears appearing in her eyes were not feigned. "Since he died, I try to do everything I can to keep the farm running." The mention of Halvard seemed to soften slightly the attitude of some warriors. They had known and respected her husband, and the image of a pregnant widow struggling alone to maintain her home awakened some compassion in their hardened hearts. But Eric was not moved at all. His eyes continued studying every detail of the scene, searching for inconsistencies in Astrid's story. "But last night," Astrid continued, inspiration striking her, "I heard many strange sounds. Howling of wolves, movements in the bushes, perhaps wild animals attacked the man and freed him accidentally while trying to, well, you know what scavengers do." The explanation was plausible, and Astrid saw how some warriors exchanged thoughtful looks. Wolves were indeed common in the area, and it was not rare for them to attack injured or weakened people. Eric considered this possibility for a moment, but his expression remained suspicious. "Perhaps you are right, Astrid Thorvald's daughters," he said finally, though his tone indicated he was not completely convinced. "But that Saxon is dangerous, and now he roams loose in the area. For your own safety, we will establish permanent watch in this area until we recapture him." The hidden escape. His words sounded like both promise and threat. Astrid's heart sank hearing this. Permanent watch meant it would be impossible to help Aelred further or even communicate with him. But she maintained her expression of feigned gratitude while responding, "I thank you very much, Jarl Eric. In my condition, Any additional protection is a blessing. Internally, she was already calculating how she might warn Aelred about this new development. After the warriors rode away, Astrid waited until the sound of hooves faded completely, before lifting the cloak covering Aelred. She found him exactly as she had left him, motionless as a statue, but his eyes were open and alert. He had heard every word of the conversation, and though he did not understand all the Norse, he had caught enough to know the situation had become much more dangerous. "Aelred," Astrid whispered urgently, "we must get you away from here. Eric will post guards throughout this area." She quickly finished cutting the remaining chains from his ankles, freeing him completely. Aelred stood slowly, massaging his painful wrists and carefully testing his ability to walk. Though weak from hours of torture, his natural strength was gradually returning. You saved me," Aelred said with voice full of deep gratitude that went beyond words. "Bema, your people and my people. Enemies." His Norse was limited, but his eyes expressed everything words could not convey. There was reverence in his gaze, recognition that Astrid had risked everything for a stranger. "Because you are a human being," Astrid responded simply. "And human beings should not suffer like that, no matter where they come from." But even as she spoke these noble words, another strong contraction tore through her abdomen, reminding her that her own situation was becoming increasingly precarious. The stress of recent days was clearly affecting her pregnancy. The hidden cave. Aelred immediately noticed her distress, and despite his own weakness, he moved to support her. "Baby comes soon," he observed with evident concern. "You need rest, not help Saxon fugitive." But Astrid shook her head stubbornly. She had come too far to turn back now. "First we must get you to safety," Astrid insisted. "I know a place where you can hide, at least for tonight." She was thinking of the small cave she had discovered years ago while exploring with Halvard. A secret place among the rocks where no one would think to search. "But you will have to trust me completely." Aelred looked into her eyes for a long moment, as if evaluating something deeper than the words she had spoken. Then he nodded slowly. "I trust," he said with simplicity that contained a world of meaning. They began walking carefully toward the hiding place, but Astrid had to stop 3 times due to contractions, and during the last one, Aelred had to support her completely to prevent her from falling. "Baby very soon," he murmured with concern. "After cave, we need find safe place quick." When they finally reached the cave hidden behind a waterfall, Astrid could no longer stand. Aelred helped her lie down on an improvised bed made from his own tunic and her cloak. The labor baby. "Now," Astrid murmured, gripping Aelred's hand with desperate strength. "I don't know if we can." Her voice broke, not from physical pain, but from overwhelming fear of bringing her child into the world under these impossible conditions. Aelred looked into her eyes with serenity that immediately calmed her. "The gods brought us together for this," he said with deep conviction. "Your baby will be born free under open sky, protected by brave mother and new grandfather who will love him as his own." His words, spoken with that mixture of broken Norse and ancestral wisdom, gave Astrid the strength she needed to face what was coming. In the darkest hours before dawn, while outside continued the distant echoes of searching warriors, Astrid gave birth to her son with Aelred as her only companion. The Saxon, who had never assisted a human birth, demonstrated natural wisdom that came from years living in harmony with life's cycles. His hands, hardened by battles and survival, became incredibly gentle while helping bring new life into the world. The first cry, When finally the baby was born with first rays of sun filtering through the cave entrance, his strong, healthy cry mixed with Astrid's tears of joy and the blessing chants Aelred sang in his native Saxon tongue. "He is strong like his mother," Aelred murmured with voice broken by emotion, receiving the newborn with reverence that spoke of the moment's sacredness. The Saxon wrapped the baby in his own tunic, now converted into the little one's first blanket, and gently placed him in Astrid's arms. "A boy," he announced with pride, as if he were the child's own grandfather. "The gods have blessed this birth with dawn. He will be man of two worlds, protected by brave mother's love and Saxon grandfather's wisdom." Outside, the world had changed. The sounds of pursuit had vanished, replaced by peaceful silence of dawn and soft singing of birds. "What shall we call him?" Astrid asked, looking at her son's perfect face. For months she had thought of names, but now, in this sacred moment, she wanted something that honored all that had passed. "Halvard," she said initially, thinking of her husband, but then she looked at Aelred, this extraordinary man who had risked everything to protect them, and added, "Halvard Elridsson, so he always remembers that family goes beyond blood." Tears ran down Elred's weathered face as he gently lifted the baby toward the dawn light entering the cave. In his native Saxon tongue, he pronounced a blessing he had learned from his own grandmother, words that spoke of protection, wisdom, and the gift of seeing humanity in all hearts. Then, in Norse, he whispered, "Little Halvard, this old warrior promises to care for you always." The new life. The days that followed were of recovery and planning. Aelred built a more comfortable shelter, hunted to ensure Astrid had necessary nutrition, and became the most devoted grandfather a child could have. His gentleness with the baby contrasted dramatically with the image of the dangerous Saxon the warriors had been pursuing. When Astrid felt strong enough to travel, they made the decision that would change their lives forever. They could not return to Ravensfjord, where Eric would remain a threat. Instead, they would head north, toward the wild lands beyond the great forests, where they could begin a new life as the unconventional family they had chosen to be. Years later, in a small settlement where questions about the past were uncommon, young Halvard played with other children, calling the Saxon man with weathered face Grandfather Aelred, with natural joy that knew no prejudice. And in that moment, Astrid realized they had achieved something more powerful than merely surviving. They had created a small world where love transcended racial barriers, where family was defined by choice and loyalty, and where a child could grow, seeing humanity in all its forms. The lesson: because sometimes the best families are born not from blood, but from the kindness we choose to share with others. And in the quiet evenings, when Aelred told Halvard the legends of his Saxon people, while Astrid listened with a smile, the three of them knew they had found the most valuable treasure, a family chosen by the heart. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more fascinating stories, Viking history's greatest figures and events.